My office had to be my first stop. There were several tasks that required my immediate attention. It took me a couple of hours to get everything done. By the time I was finished it was afternoon, but that still left me plenty of time to complete the rest of my errands. My second stop was a discount electronics store, where I purchased a compact digital voice recorder and a miniature camera. As soon as I returned to my car I opened the packages and read the directions. The digital voice recorder was powered by 2 AA batteries. They were included in the package. I inserted them and spent several minutes playing with the recorder. Once I was certain I understood how to use it, I slipped it into my shirt pocket and turned my attention to the camera. It had to be charged and I probably wasn't going to need it until the following Friday. Realizing that I had ample time to figure out how it worked, I set it aside. While I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do with the voice recorder, I had an idea. There were some old friends at Bratis who might be able to tell me what Katie was doing on Friday nights. If they confirmed my fears, I wanted to be able to record their statements so I could play them back for my wife when I finally confronted her about her cheating. I started my car. 10 minutes later I pulled into Bratis parking lot. It was just after 1 o'clock. The spots around the door were already full. Bratis had a dedicated group of baseball fans that came in every Saturday to watch the afternoon games. I parked my car, went inside and walked over to the bar. As I was sitting down I noticed that Mike Colbert was working. I was in luck. Mike and I were good friends. He was busy washing some glasses. I didn't say anything. As soon as he was finished he looked up and said, "Hey buddy, what can I get?" Suddenly he stopped and grinned at me. "If it ain't Frankie Reese." He held out his hand. "How you doin', buddy? It's been a long time since I've seen your sorry ass in here. How's the new bride?" I shook Mike's hand. "It's nice to see you too, Mike. I've missed this place." I deliberately ignored the question about my wife. "How come you ain't been comin' in?" Shrugging, I said, "I don't know. I guess bars just aren't part of my life anymore." He nodded. "Yeah, I understand. Sometimes I wish they weren't part of my life either." I laughed. "Be careful what you wish for. You wouldn't want to be out of work." "Yeah, you sure got that right." Mike was chuckling. Suddenly he glanced to his right. Turning, I saw that a middle-aged blonde, wearing a tight, low-cut blouse and short skirt was standing at the bar. I smiled when I recognized her. It was Rhonda Morgan, a waitress. She was another good friend. Mike waved to her, and then pointing at me, he said, "Hey Rhonda, look who's here." Rhonda looked at me for a moment, and then her face broke into a huge smile. "Frankie Reese, aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" I nodded. "Rhonda, you always were the most beautiful cocktail waitress in the Western world, but I have to say that you are even more gorgeous today than you used to be." She laughed. "Frankie, you haven't changed a bit. You're still a notorious flatterer." "I'm just tellin' the truth, doll. Nothin' but the truth." She walked over and patted my cheek. "I've missed you. You always knew how to make us laugh." I smiled at her. She sat down on the bar stool next to me and asked, "Okay, so what finally brings you back to Bratis after all this time?" I sighed. "Rhonda, I need your help." "Sure, sweetie. Anything. Just ask." "Were you working last night?" "Sure. It was Friday night." "That's the biggest night of the week. I'd be a fool to take that night off." Mike was working too. I glanced at him. He nodded. I took a picture of Katie out of my shirt pocket and handed it to Rhonda. "Do you recognize this woman?" After studying it for a moment she said, "Sure. She's one of those secretaries from the insurance company down the street. They come in every Friday night. Her name is Katie." She handed the picture to Mike. He looked at it and then he said, "That's right. Her name is Katie." Rhonda shook her head. "Kind of a funny kid." "What do you mean?" "When she first started coming in she was real shy. Never talked to anyone but the other insurance girls. Don't get me wrong. She was nice, always very polite, but she never socialized with anyone else in the bar, and she always went home when the dancing started." Mike nodded in agreement. Rhonda continued, "About 2 months ago that all changed. She started to stay later. She's a real cutie, so the guys all began asking her to dance. At first she just blew him off, but then that changed too." Mike leaned across the bar. "That older woman, that comes in with the insurance girls." He looked at Rhonda. "What's her name?" "Andrea." "Yeah, that's it. Andrea. It seemed like she kept urging Katie on, you know, kind of prodding her to dance with the guys." Rhonda said, "That's right. When a guy would ask Katie to dance, Andrea would say stuff like, 'Come on, Katie.'" Mike said, "Andrea's a real backseat bunny." Rhonda agreed. "Yeah, big time." I sighed. A backseat bunny is a slang term the regulars at Bratis used to describe a woman who'll go out to the parking lot with a guy. One Friday night about a month ago this guy walks up to Katie and asks her to dance. Everyone's watching. None of us liked the guy and we were all waiting to see him get shot down. Katie shocked the hell out of us. She said yes. After that the guys started lining up to ask her to dance. I mean, she is a real cutie, and all of them were hoping to get a piece of her. Rhonda shook her head. Boy, did she change fast. That night she let Ricky Thomas take her out to the parking lot. You remember Ricky, don't you? He's a tall, good-looking guy. I nodded. Yeah, I remember Ricky. Rhonda shrugged. For the next few Friday nights Katie was the queen of the backseat bunnies. Mike laughed. The boys were all jostling for position. Every one of them wanted to be the anointed one. Rhonda smiled. They sure did. But then it all stopped. What happened? Rhonda sighed. She found a boyfriend. Those words broke my heart. I quietly said, "Tell me about him." Rhonda said, "His name is Pete Munson. You don't know him. He started coming in here about a year ago. He's a little older, maybe 40 or 45, but he's damn good looking. He's real puss hound and an arrogant man." Mike laughed. "He's a lawyer." He said the word lawyer in a tone of voice that suggested that it was the explanation for why this Munson guy was such an arrogant asshole. He's married and he flaunts the fact that he's cheating on his wife. He always wears his wedding ring while he's in here hitting on women. But he is handsome and very smooth. Rhonda smiled. When I first met him he sure as hell made my heart go flip-flop. I said, "From the way you put that, I gather your opinion has changed." "Oh yeah. Once you get to know him it's easy to see that Pete Munson is a self-centered superficial jerk." Rhonda laughed. "But he sure is handsome. I get the feeling that you'd still give him a tumble if he asked for it. I don't think I'd be happy about it afterward." Suddenly Rhonda paused and stared at me. "Frankie, why are you asking about Katie? Who is she?" I took a deep breath and said, "Rhonda, she's my wife." For a moment Rhonda, Mike and I stared at each other. Finally Rhonda said, "Frankie, I'm so sorry." I sighed. "Thanks, this is killing me." Rhonda reached over and patted my knee. "Poor baby. When did you start to suspect that something was going on?" "Not until last night. She didn't get home until after 3 o'clock this morning." Rhonda looked at Mike. "Didn't they leave here between 10 o'clock and 10:30? Mike nodded. "Pete got here at about 8:30. They hooked up right away. When the music video started at 9 o'clock, they danced a few times and then they moved to that booth back there." He pointed to a booth in the back corner of the bar. I knew the booth. It was used by couples that wanted a little extra privacy. They sat down on the same side of the booth. As soon as they were settled, Pete put his arms around your wife. Mike's voice was very quiet. He wasn't getting any pleasure from telling me this. Rhonda shook her head. "Put's an asshole. He gets a kick out of showing off to the rest of the guys in the bar." Mike chuckled. "He sure is an asshole. He'll be in here tonight or tomorrow night bragging about what he did with your wife last night." Suddenly he stopped. "Sorry Frankie, that didn't come out right." I held my up hand. "It's okay. None of this is easy to hear. I just have to get through it." Rhonda stood up, put her arm around me, and gently rubbed my shoulder. "Baby, is there anything we can do to help you?" I nodded. "Yes, there is." A good-looking man in his early 40s walked up to the bar and sat down 3 stools to my right. Mike walked over to him and said, "Hi Mitch, what can I get you?" "I'll have an MGD light." While Mike was getting his beer Rhonda leaned over and whispered, "That's Mitchell Wayland. He's Pete Munson's best friend. If Mitch is here you can bet that it won't be long before Pete shows up." Suddenly I was glad that I had the voice recorder in my pocket. Mike put a bottle of MGD light and a small glass in front of Mitch. Mitch had already set a $20 bill on the bar. Mike picked it up and went to the cash register. A moment later, he returned with Mitch's change and set it in front of him. Mitch left the pile of money lying on the bar and poured some of his beer into the glass. He was just taking a sip when another man entered the bar and walked over to the stool on Mitch's left. As he was sitting down Rhonda whispered to me, "That's Pete Munson." I studied him. He was a tall man, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", with broad muscular shoulders and a narrow waist. Both his long black hair and his neatly trimmed Van Dyke beard were streaked with hints of gray. He was nattily dressed in a pair of black slacks, a tight-fitting yellow golf shirt, and a pair of expensive-looking black Italian loafers. Mitch patted his friend's shoulder and said, "Hey buddy, how ya doing?" Pete shook his head. "Mitch, I'm beat." Mitch turned to Mike. "My buddy needs an MGD light." He tapped the pile of money in front of him. "Take it out of this." Mike nodded and got another beer. Mitch turned back to his friend and laughed. "What? Did Katie wear you out last night?" Pete chuckled. "She was a girl in heat. She couldn't get enough of me." Rhonda squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "This is going to be tough. Keep your cool. This is not the time to make a scene." I smiled at Rhonda. "Don't worry. The last thing I want to do right now is make a scene. I have a better plan." Reaching into my pocket, I turned on the voice recorder, and then I opened a napkin on the bar. I took some pretzels from the basket in front of me, set them on the napkin, took the recorder out of my pocket, and subtly slipped it under the napkin. Once it was in place I sat back on my bar stool hoping that I was now recording everything that Pete Munson was saying to his friend. At first I was concerned that the voice recorder might not be able to pick up the voices from 2 bar stools away, But Pete was a braggart. Wanting to be sure that everyone in the bar heard about his conquest with my wife, he spoke in a loud voice. I with Katie last night. After we were both so worn out that we fell asleep. We didn't wake up until 2:45. When she saw how late it was, Katie went into a total panic. She was terrified about what was going to happen if her husband was awake when she got home. I tried to calm her down, but she was hysterical. She wouldn't listen. She just ran out to her car. Where were you? Same place we always go, the King's Motor Inn. Pete laughed. Benny the night clerk, and I get along pretty good. I have an informal understanding with him that I'm going to be using room 129 every Tuesday and Friday night. I like that room because it's right next to the door at the far end of the hall. Once I get a key, Katie, and I can park outside and slip in without having to worry about running into someone in the hallway. You're seeing Katie on Tuesday nights too? Yeah, that just started. She tells her husband that she's having dinner with that old broad, Andrea. Andrea isn't that old. In fact, I think she's pretty hot. Pete shook his head. No, I'm really not. Andrea's too old for me. Mitch laughed and then he asked, was Dana awake when you got home last night? No, she was sound asleep. She's working about 80 hours a week at her old man's plant right now. When she gets home from work, she's always so exhausted that all she can manage to do is have a bite to eat and go right to bed. We almost never see each other. Couldn't you be helping her with the business? Yeah, we've talked about that. But if I started helping her, I wouldn't have any time for my extracurricular activities. That's true, but you'd have more time for your wife. Sure, but why would I want that? She's older than Andrea. Why don't you just divorce her? Pete shook his head. Mitch, old buddy, you know damn well why I can't do that. How much do you think her dad's business is worth? Well over $300 million. This is a no-fault divorce state. Wouldn't you still get a good chunk of that money if you divorced Dana? Munson shook his head. There's two reasons that wouldn't happen. First of all, old man Kendall is still alive. Dana has to inherit the business before I could collect any of that money. I turned and looked at Rhonda. I was shocked. Rhonda read my expression and mouthed the word, "What?" Putting up my hand up, I whispered, "I'll tell you later." Mitch looked at his buddy. What's the other reason? Old man Kendall made me sign a prenup before I married his daughter. You're an attorney, you could break a prenup, couldn't you? Maybe, but it wouldn't be easy. Kendall Metal Fabricating has a solid cadre of top-notch lawyers on retainer. Mitch stared at Pete. Wouldn't you be in some pretty deep, man, if you got caught cheating? Pete nodded. I sure would. I'd be right out the door without a penny to my name. You've got your law practice. That's just a front so I don't have to go to work at the plant. I spend about 2 hours a day at the office. I have it set up so that after 3 rings, my office telephone switches over to my cell phone. Pete laughed. I haven't had a paying client in over 6 months. So you're living off your wife? Pete smiled. And it's a good living. Mitch shook his head. If you have so much to lose by cheating on Dana, why do you keep doing it? Mainly because I have a real thing for young girl. But I have to admit that the risk of getting caught adds to the thrill. Aren't you afraid that you'll eventually get caught? No. I'm too careful and too smart. What about Caddy's husband? What if he gets suspicious and starts nosing around? It'll never happen. He's some nerd engineer. He's too dumb to figure it out. How much longer are you going to keep this thing going with Katie? Pete shrugged. I don't know. A few weeks. Maybe a month. I'll eventually get bored with her. And then I'll find someone new. He grinned at his buddy. You want her when I'm done? You really think you can do that? Pete nodded. I'll bet I can. Mitch laughed. You sure don't have a shortage of self-esteem. Yeah, I'd love to have Katie when you're finished with her. I want to do one thing first. What's that? I want to in her house. Why do you want to do that? I want to mark my territory. Katie says that he occasionally has to travel for his job. The next time the sorry bastard leaves town, I'm going to his house. Mitch shook his head. You are a piece of work. Pete laughed. I've already done the other thing I wanted to do. What was that? Every Saturday night Katie and her sad sack husband have what they call a date night. I found this out because I tried to get her to go out with me 2 Saturdays ago. She refused. When I asked her why, she told me about date night. On Saturday night she and her husband always make a nice dinner together, watch a romantic movie and then spend the rest of the evening together. She told you that? I found out indirectly. Mitch shook his head. You do live an exciting life. You'd better believe it, buddy. So what was the nasty thing you did? Pete smiled at his friend. I'm proud of this one. I laid a pretty good con on Katie. This was a week ago last night. I just told you that I tried to get Katie to go out with me 2 Saturdays ago and she refused because it was her date night with her husband. Mitch nodded. So we at the King's Motor Inn. I told her that Dana was going to be out of town for the weekend and I was going to be all alone on Saturday night. Grinning at Mitch, Pete said, I gave her my best smile and asked her if she couldn't possibly consider canceling date night with her husband just one time. Pete shook his head. She wouldn't even consider it. But I didn't care. I didn't really want to get together with her on Saturday night. I knew that Dana was going to be home, and I had to spend some time with her. What did you do? Mitch was very interested in his friend's story. I proposed a compromise. Since she couldn't get together with me on Saturday night, I asked her if she would consider slipping away for a few hours on Saturday afternoon. She asked if that would make me feel better. I told her that it would. She said that she couldn't guarantee that she could slip away, but she promised to try. Pete chuckled. She called me just after noon and told me that she'd told her husband that she was going shopping, and she'd meet me at the King's Motor Lodge at 3 o'clock. Mitch shook his head. Pete, you are a real bastard. He grinned. Yes, I most certainly am. He stood up and picked up his bottle of beer. Come on. The Yankees are on television. Let's go find a table, order some lunch and watch the game. Mitch picked up his beer and followed his friend over to a table. As soon as Pete and Mitch were out of earshot, Rhonda said, I've changed my mind. Frankie, that had to be awfully hard for you to hear. I smiled at Rhonda and Mike. It wasn't easy, but there are two huge silver linings. Rhonda stared at me. Tell us. Mike nodded. Yeah, I want to hear this too. You're right. His comments about my wife and me really pissed me off. They also hurt. He stabbed me right in the gut. I want to get this guy. I want to get him real bad. I grinned at them, and during his nasty little chat he very generously provided me with all the tools I'll need to nail his. I pulled the voice recorder out from under the napkin. First of all, I think I have all of the conversation recorded on this. Rhonda smiled. I saw you slip that under the napkin. That's excellent. What else do you have? I grinned at them. I happen to know Put's wife. I not only know her, I talk on the telephone with her at least 3 times a week, and we're pretty good friends. Mike shook his head. No, I'm a structural engineer. I work for Jupiter Construction. We build highways, bridges, and office buildings. When you build a bridge, an office building, or a shopping center, you have to make use of a substantial number of steel plates, couplings, joints, trusses, and connectors. Kendall Metal Fabrication just happens to be the largest supplier of those items in the Midwest. I smiled at Mike and Rhonda. The man Pete referred to as Old Man Kendall is Arthur Kendall. Arthur Kendall is the majority stockholder, chairman of the board of directors, and chief executive officer of Kendall Metal Fabrication. His son, William Kendall, is vice president in charge of manufacturing. His daughter, Dana Munson, Put's wife, is vice president in charge of sales and marketing. Jupiter Construction just happens to be their largest customer. Rhonda quietly said, Oh my. But that wasn't the most important tidbit that I overheard. Mike grinned at me. Go on, this keeps getting better. I was trying to figure out how to go about getting documented proof of Katie and Pitt's infidelity. I held up the recorder. This recording was made without Munson's knowledge. It won't be admissible in court. I want to nail the arrogant bastard. I need evidence that can be used in a lawsuit. I was planning to ask the two of you to take some pictures Friday night, and I was going to take some pictures of them going in and out of the motel. Rhonda shrugged. I'll do that, Frankie. Mike nodded. So will I. Thank you. If things don't go according to plan, I might still have to ask you to do that. I shook my head. But I'd like to avoid it. That plan has some major flaws. Max may not be all that crazy about his employees taking compromising pictures of his customers. Katie and Pete aren't the only two people carrying on an illicit love affair in this bar. If it gets out that the two of you were involved in exposing Katie and Pete, other couples might get nervous about meeting here. Rhonda sighed. I hadn't considered that. That's not the only flaw. If we're lucky, we might get some pictures of Pete and Katie making out in a booth. They could contend that it was a one-time occurrence caused by a little too much to drink. Pictures taken here might not be enough to establish that Pete and Katie were carrying on an adulterous relationship. Mike looked at me. Frankie, this is a no-fault divorce state. You don't need to establish adultery. You're right. And if I was just trying to divorce Katie, I probably wouldn't care. But after what we just overheard, I want to destroy Pete Munson. Rhonda smiled. So do I. How do we do it? He told Mitch that he wants to in my house. That's how we get him. If I want something that's admissible in court, I can't wire a motel room for sound. I can't put cameras in a motel room, and I can't burst into a motel room and catch them. But I can sure as hell do all of that in my own house. Monday night I'm going to tell Katie that on Wednesday I have to go to Kansas City to solve some problems with the bridge we're building there. I'm hoping that Pete won't be able to resist taking advantage in my house. Mike shook his head. Frankie, do you know anything about surveillance equipment? Nope. I'll have to hire someone to set it all up. Won't that be expensive? Yes, it will. But tomorrow morning I plan to recruit some allies, who I suspect will be very eager to help with the expenses. I held up the voice recorder. That's where this will be useful. Rhonda laughed. Let me guess. Dana Munson. I smiled. And her father, Arthur Kendall. I glanced at my watch. It was just after 3 o'clock. I still had One more stop to make. I stood up. I have to go. I have one more errand to run and I promised Katie that I'd be home by 6 o'clock. Frankie, after what you heard this afternoon, why would you worry about any promises you made to her? She certainly hasn't kept any of the promises she made to you. Rhonda, you're right, but I want to avoid alerting Katie. For the next few days it's absolutely essential that she remains confident that I'm not even the least bit suspicious that she might be having an affair. Rhonda shook her head. Frankie, honey, you're a very smart man. There's also another reason. What's that? Remember Pete telling Mitch that he set it up so he could with Katie before our date night? Yes. That was a pretty nasty thing to do. When Katie got home that afternoon she had some fancy bath crystals that she'd bought at a cosmetics shop. That evening she told me that she wanted to try out her new bath crystals. Rhonda laughed. Suddenly her expression became serious. Frankie, Katie has made some major mistakes, but she still loves you. Yes, she obviously does, and that complicates things. Frankie, what? Rhonda had an impish smile on her face. Once this has all blown up, and you've caught Katie and Pete, I hope you'll tell the bastard that story. I laughed. Rhonda, honey, I love the way you think. Hey, will you guys be here on Wednesday? Mike nodded. Yes. We'll both be here by 10:30. We have to open at 11 for the lunch crowd. I'll stop by in the afternoon and fill you in on what's happening. Rhonda kissed my cheek. Be strong, baby. Thanks. I'll try. I turned. As I walked out the door I glanced over at Pete Munson. Just looking at the bastard made me angry. After I left Bradis I drove over to a coffee shop that advertised free wireless internet and went inside with my tablet. I bought a cup of coffee and found a table. As soon as I was logged onto the internet I searched for home surveillance equipment. I quickly learned about pinhole cameras and wireless transmitters. Once I was satisfied that I understood the available technology I did another search to find local businesses that sold this kind of equipment. Most of the listings I found were for companies that specialized in surveillance equipment for large businesses like stores and banks. Those were useless. There was however one listing that did catch my eye. It simply said, Wheeler Home Security. We specialize in discrete household surveillance systems. Hoping someone would still be there on Saturday afternoon, I took out my cell phone and called the number. The phone rang twice and then it was picked up. Wheeler Security, Jeff Wheeler speaking. How may I help you? Mr. Wheeler, I'm interested in setting up a very discreet system that will allow me to monitor the activities in my house. Discreet is the key word here. Do you do that kind of work? Yes. In fact, we specialize in that type of work. Can I come over and see you this afternoon? I'll be here until 5. I looked at my watch. It was 3:25. According to the listing on the internet, your address is 128 South 5th Street. Is that still correct? Yes, that's correct. There's a sign over the door. You should be able to park on the street. I can be there in 10 minutes. I'll be waiting for you. The 120 block of South 5th Street was located in an old neighborhood on the outer edge of the city's business district. Number 128 was a tiny storefront wedged between a computer repair shop and a locksmith. A small sign above the door read, Wheeler Security. I parked on the street in front, dropped 4 quarters into the parking meter and went inside. The space looked more like an office than a store. In the middle of the room there was a steel desk with 2 chairs in front of it. On the wall to my left there was a row of 5 steel file cabinets. On the opposite wall, there were 4 large 2-door metal storage cabinets. They were all locked. A middle-aged, bald-headed man was seated behind the desk. He was reading what appeared to be a technical journal. When he heard me come in he looked up. I said, Mr. Wheeler, my name is Franklin Reese. I just called you. He stood up and extended his hand. Mr. Reese, I'm Jeff Wheeler. He motioned to one of the chairs in front of his desk. Won't you please sit down? Thank you. As soon as we were both seated he asked, How can I help you? Mr. Wheeler, I'm going to get right to the point. I think that would be a good idea. My wife is cheating on me. Is that just a suspicion or are you certain about it? I'm certain. He sighed. Mr. Reese, I'm very sorry to hear that. I nodded to acknowledge his comment, and then I continued. I'm certain that she's cheating, but I don't have definitive proof. I assume you're referring to photographic or video evidence. Yes. Why do you want it? This is a no-fault divorce state. If you're looking for evidence to support a divorce claim, you really don't need it. Let's just say that this is a slightly more complicated situation, and when the battle starts, I'll feel much more secure if I have some hard evidence to back up my claims. Very well. It's your money. Tell me some more about the situation. Actually, I have a plan. Go ahead. When I come home from work on Monday evening, I'm going to tell my wife that I have to go to Kansas City on Wednesday morning on business and I won't be home again until Thursday afternoon. I'm reasonably certain that she and her lover will take full advantage of my absence and spend Wednesday night together in our house. I would like you to set up a system that can monitor what's happening in our living room and bedroom. You want this for one day? Yes, I can do it. But it's going to be expensive. I'm an engineer. Tell me what you can do. All right. Our wireless transmitter can accommodate up to 4 cameras. I'll set up 2 cameras in your living room and 2 in the bedroom. The cameras are small and easy to conceal. I'll set up a transmitter in your attic and a relay transmitter in a tree outside your house. That way we should be able to monitor and record the activities inside your house from a distance of at least 2 city blocks. If you would like, I can provide a van with the words Wheeler Cable Repair painted on both sides and 2 technicians. One to drive the van and the other to monitor and record the video feeds. How much will that cost me? I'll set up and provide that service for a period of 24 hours for $3,000. 48 hours will cost you $5,000. How long will it take you to set it up? We should be able to do all of the work in less than an hour. Can I arrange to have the monitoring go from 6 a.m. Wednesday until 6 a.m. Thursday? Absolutely. If I give you a key, can you install the equipment while my wife is at work on Tuesday? Yes, that would be ideal. Mr. Wheeler filled out a standard contract form. I signed it and gave him a check for $1,000 as a down payment, with the understanding that the balance would be paid as soon as the job was completed. Once that was done, I stood up, thanked him, and arranged to stop by his office Monday afternoon to drop off a key for our house. When I got to my car, I glanced at my watch. It was 4:45, time for me to go home. During the drive to my house, I focused my attention on mentally preparing myself for the evening ahead. If my plan was going to work, it was essential that for the next few days, Katie continued to believe that I was totally oblivious about her affair with Pete Munson. My wife was expecting a romantic date night, and I was going to have to keep my anger in check. She had to remain convinced that I was still a loving, eager husband,